He confessed on a Monday morning. Standing in his own driveway, in the same Colorado suburb where his neighbors waved to him every morning, where his daughters rode their bikes on the sidewalk, where his wife had just posted a pregnancy announcement 4 days earlier. He told investigators his wife had killed their daughters. He said he'd watched it happen. He said he strangled her in a rage. He said he had no choice. Every word was a lie. But here's the thing. On that Monday morning, August 13, 2018, the police didn't know that yet. His neighbors didn't know that. The entire country watching this story unfold on the news didn't know that. Because Chris Watts looked exactly like a grieving father. He cried on cue. He asked the cameras to bring his family home. He stood in his driveway with his arms open, begging for answers, while 4 miles away, in an oil field he had driven to the morning before, his pregnant wife and 2 daughters were already buried. What you're about to hear is not just the story of a man who murdered his family. It's the story of how a man became someone capable of doing it. And why, even after a full confession, even after the bodies were found, even after he sat in a room and told investigators everything, there are still questions that don't have clean answers. The Watts family looked perfect. And that wasn't an accident. Shanann Watts was 34 years old, originally from North Carolina, the kind of woman who turned every part of her life into a story worth sharing. She had built a following on Facebook. Thousands of people who watched her morning routines, her kids' personalities, her husband's birthday surprises. She sold health products through a company called Thrive and documented her journey publicly, openly, sometimes painfully honestly. She had talked about almost losing her marriage 2 years earlier. She had talked about financial stress. She had talked about her daughter Bella's peanut allergy, about how she'd almost lost her at a family barbecue. She talked about everything. Except what was happening in August 2018. Because something had changed. And Shanann, who shared everything, had gone quiet. She had just returned from a work trip to Arizona. 6 weeks earlier, Chris had taken a solo trip to North Carolina. When he came back from that trip, people close to Shanann noticed something. He was different. Distant. She had noticed it too. What she didn't know, what none of his neighbors knew, what his own family didn't know, was that Chris Watts had met someone. Her name was Nicole Kessinger. She worked at the same oil company as Chris. They had started sleeping together in late June 2018. And by August, Chris Watts had decided something. He wanted a new life. The question investigators would later spend months trying to answer was this: when exactly did he decide what he would have to do to get it? At 5:17 a.m. on August 13, 2018, Chris Watts left his house. He drove to his oil site. He spent a few hours there. Then he drove home. A neighbor's security camera caught him leaving before dawn with his truck loaded. It caught him returning with it empty. When police arrived that afternoon, called by a friend who couldn't reach Shanann and was worried, Chris Watts met them in the driveway. He was calm. Cooperative. He answered every question. He led them inside. He walked them through the house. Nothing looked disturbed. Shanann's wedding ring was on the nightstand. Her phone was in the house. Her car was in the garage. Chris told police she had left that morning after an argument. He said he didn't know where she was. He said he tried to call her. He said he was worried. The lead investigator, Agent Tammy Lee of the FBI, would later say that from the first moment she met Chris Watts, she felt something was off. Not dramatically. Not obviously. Just wrong in a way that took time to name. He didn't ask the right questions. When you're a parent and your wife and 2 daughters are missing, there's a specific kind of panic that takes over. You demand answers. You call every hospital. You call every friend. You shake someone's hand and forget to let go. Chris Watts answered questions. He didn't ask them. By that evening, he was in front of a camera. Local Denver news station KMGH had reached out. Chris agreed to an interview. He sat on his porch and talked to the reporter. He cried. He said he wanted his family back. He said he loved them. He said he hoped whoever had them would let them go. The footage aired nationally within hours. Millions of people watched a man grieve. And millions of people, without any evidence, without any information, felt something was wrong. The comment sections filled up. Reddit threads started. True crime communities began dissecting every frame, every pause, every blink. People noted that he wiped his eye without producing a tear. They noted the specific way he answered questions. They noted that he used the past tense once, just once, before catching himself. The internet had already decided. But here's where the story gets complicated. Because investigators were not the internet. They had to prove it. And on the morning of August 14, less than 24 hours after that interview, they asked Chris Watts to come in for a polygraph. He agreed immediately. He failed immediately. Not spectacularly. Not in the way that makes it obvious. But the examiner came out of that room and told Agent Lee, "This man is not telling the truth about knowing where his family is." And then they showed him the neighbor's security footage. The footage showed his truck leaving the house loaded, returning empty. Before Shanann's friend, the one who called police, had even arrived. Which meant Shanann and the girls weren't missing. They had been somewhere specific since before dawn. Agent Lee brought Chris back into the interrogation room. She didn't accuse him. She didn't yell. She did something more effective. She told him she believed him. She told him she thought something had happened in that house that he hadn't told them about. She told him she thought there was more to the story. She told him she could see he was carrying something heavy. And then she told him about the polygraph. And then she showed him the video. Chris Watts sat quietly for a long moment. And then he told them a story. He said that on the morning of August 13, he had gone upstairs and found Shanann in the act of strangling their daughter Celeste. That he had lost control. That he had strangled Shanann in a rage. That after she was dead, he had discovered both daughters were also dead. He said he panicked. He said he didn't know what to do. He said he drove to the oil site and buried them. He cried as he said it. Agent Lee listened. And then she asked him one question that she would later describe as the turning point of the entire investigation. She asked him, "When you drove to that oil site, were the girls already dead?" He hesitated. Just for a second. He said yes. He was lying again. Here's what the autopsy would later reveal. Bella and Celeste Watts were not dead when they arrived at that oil field. The evidence, which investigators and prosecutors have been careful about discussing publicly, suggested the girls were alive when Chris drove them there. Alive when he carried them. What happened to them in that field, in those final minutes, is the part of this case that even the most hardened investigators struggled to process. Bella was 4 years old. Celeste was 3. Shanann was 15 weeks pregnant. Chris Watts was arrested on August 15, 2018. He was charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder, 2 counts of first-degree murder of a child, 1 count of unlawful termination of a pregnancy, and 3 counts of tampering with a human body. And then something almost nobody expected happened. He confessed. Not just to police. In November 2018, just 3 months after his arrest and 1 day before the trial was set to begin, Chris Watts pleaded guilty to all 9 charges. He gave a full confession in exchange for life in prison without the possibility of parole instead of the death penalty. The confession saved the prosecution from having to put Shanann's family through a trial. But it opened a new set of questions. Because when Chris Watts sat down and told investigators exactly what he had done, and exactly when he had decided to do it, the picture that emerged was both clearer and more disturbing than anyone had imagined. He had planned it the night before. That's the part that changes everything. When Shanann came home from her Arizona trip at 1:48 a.m. on August 13, Chris was awake. They talked. It wasn't a screaming fight. By most accounts, it was almost quiet. The kind of conversation that happens when a marriage has already ended and both people are just confirming what they already know. Shanann told him she wanted to work on the marriage. She told him about the pregnancy. She wanted them to try. Chris had already decided. He waited until she fell asleep. He strangled her in their bed. Then he went to the girls' rooms. He confessed to what happened to them. He then carried Shanann's body to his truck, then the girls. He drove in the dark to an oil facility his employer controlled. A place he had access to, a place he thought was remote enough, a place with oil tanks large enough to hide something. He buried Shanann in a shallow grave. He disposed of the girls in the oil tanks. He drove home. He made his daughter's lunch for the next day and put it in the fridge. He texted Shanann from her own phone to a friend so it would look like she was still alive. Then he waited for the cameras. This is the part of the Chris Watts story that people keep returning to, years later. Not just the horror of what he did, but who he seemed to be before he did it. Chris Watts's neighbors described him as the nicest guy on the street. His co-workers described him as mild, professional, a little reserved. His daughters adored him. There was not, according to anyone who knew him, a single moment of visible violence. No history of abuse. No prior arrests. No warning signs that fit the profile. And yet, he had been building toward this for longer than most people realize. Investigators who spent time with Chris Watts in prison after his conviction, including Detective Dave Baumhover, who conducted a series of interviews in February 2019, came away with a portrait of a man who had been living in a state of complete emotional suppression for years. A man who never said what he felt. Who never confronted what he wanted. Who smiled and waved and mowed his lawn and let pressure build and build and build. Until it didn't anymore. That is not an explanation. That is not an excuse. But it is something that keeps investigators up at night. Because Chris Watts is not the only man who looked like a good neighbor right up until the morning everything changed. Nicole Kessinger cooperated with investigators. She had no idea what Chris was planning. She had no knowledge of what happened to Shanann and the girls. When she found out, when she watched the news on August 15 and realized the man she had been sleeping with had been arrested for murdering his pregnant wife and daughters, she called police immediately. She gave them everything. Texts, call logs, details of conversations. She told investigators that Chris had told her his marriage was already over, that he and Shanann had separated, that the pregnancy wasn't real. Every word of it was a lie. And Nicole Kessinger had believed it. She later gave an interview to the Denver Post in which she talked about her own processing of what had happened. She described the moment she realized she had been completely deceived by someone she thought she knew. She has not spoken publicly since. Shanann's parents, Frank and Sandra Rusek, sat in a courtroom in November 2018 and listened to Chris Watts read a prepared statement at his sentencing. He said he was sorry. He read words about his daughters, about Shanann, about the baby they had planned to name Nico. Sandy Rusek looked at him and said, "You took my daughter's breath away for the last time." She asked him, "Why? Why did you destroy our whole family?" He didn't have an answer. He still doesn't. Not one that makes any sense. There are questions this case will never fully answer. There is the question of whether, if Shanann had known about Nicole Kessinger, things would have gone differently. Whether a different conversation that night, a confrontation instead of a quiet talk, would have changed something. We will never know. There is the question of the marriage itself. Of how two people can build a life together, have children together, stand in front of cameras together, and have so little genuine communication that one of them commits an act like this before the other one even knows the marriage is truly over. There is the question of what Bella and Celeste understood in those last moments. Whether they were afraid. Whether they called for him. Those questions have no answers. And maybe that's the hardest part of this story to sit with. We live in a world where we believe that monsters announce themselves. That violence has a warning label. That the people who do things like this are somehow visibly different from the rest of us. Christopher Watts drove his daughters to school. He grilled burgers at neighborhood cookouts. He waved at his neighbors. He told his wife he loved her. And one morning in August, he became the worst thing that had ever happened to the people who trusted him most. There was no warning. There was no announcement. There was just a man who decided. And a family that never came home.